thank you all for being here. Thank you, Karen, also finding time in your very, very busy schedule. And let me say that we in the Human Rights Committee have set 3 priorities for the coming committee. As you might know, I have had the privilege of succeeding Markus Löning as chair of the Human Rights Committee, and we know that it's the only international with the Human Rights Committee. So this is one of the 3 priorities we have. And we have also set up a working group inside the committee, working with digitalization, because we realize that there are so many human rights dimensions inside the digitalization. And the working group has had some meetings, and we have been starting to work on what we say would be the 10 liberal principles of digitalization and human rights. And certainly we should point out that we are not talking about all aspects of digitalization, but we are talking about the aspects were very, very with big implication for human rights. And I think as we continue the work, we see all the time more and more a need for such principles. We made also a survey which showed that only 1/3 of Liberal International's member parties has any position paper, and then I'm talking in a broad sense, position paper on human rights and digitalization. And certainly this is something where we find the need, and we hope to be helpful as always for our member parties. I think we are very privileged to have this audience with us and the speakers today, because it's such a specialized area. Things happen quickly. During the COVID-19 crisis, we have seen new issues emerge. The data, let's say, surveillance, or let's say apps that would help tracing people, that has been first very much on the topic. And we know that both Diego and Karen have been forceful liberal voices in that context. We have now, these days, there are many consultations going on in EU, and excuse me for being a little bit EU-centered, but I think that the rest of the world also looks to EU to set some principles, because if the EU doesn't have good principles, and then I don't know what sides besides the civil society which could be relied on. I'm saying so much is happening because we could read today in the newspapers, or let's say papers, that Germany had some remarks on the artificial intelligence paper by the Commission white paper, and they were not entirely satisfied. And I think that's one of very, very, very interesting discussion. What safeguards for use of artificial intelligence? Are we satisfied that you just say what are the risky areas and what are the areas where you need to have really transparency on how artificial intelligence is used? Facial recognition is, of course, something that liberals very, very much talk about. And may I say now that as we have our friend from Hong Kong, you Glacier, I think you have special knowledge on also what does, let's say, a very restrictive way of using digitalization. What can that mean for democracy movements? Before I turn the micro to Karen, let me say that we might reserve some minutes at the end when all of us come together to hear about Hong Kong, because may I say, also in the presence of Markus, who has met so many of the democracy activists in Hong Kong, may I say that we were appalled and our sadness was immense yesterday when all the details of the so-called security law was revealed, and we saw what it means and what the leading persons in the democracy movement is saying about the consequences for them personally. But my suggestion is that, Glacia, you will come back for, let's say, 5 minutes at the end for 5 to 10 minutes at the end, and tell how things are now and what it means also for your NGO and your personal work and the democracy movement. And finally, let me thank ELF very much for hosting us, because their technology is extremely good, and it's helpful, really helpful that you help us with this. And I think without further ado, very much welcome. Fun to be with you, and thanks, Karin, for once more being with us and moderating this debate.
Thank you very much, Astrid, and thank you very much for your leadership of the Human Rights Committee setting focus on this. Just a brief reminder that the session is being live streamed, and you can also comment via Twitter using hashtag #LIPolicyLab and also hashtag #ELFevent. And I will give the floor to our two distinguished panelists. First to Glacier for opening remarks for 5 minutes, and then to Diego. We'll then have a Q&A session, and then we'll end the Facebook stream, and we'll break out into smaller groups. Glacier is the founder of an NGO called Keyboard Freedom, which works on surveilling privacy and censorship online, and also played a key role in the umbrella movement in Hong Kong in 2014. Please, Glacier, happy that you're here with us.
Hi, thank you very much for having me, and I believe it's good afternoon to you all, even though it's nighttime in Hong Kong. And I would like to thank Elle for having me as one of the speakers here today to share with you my thoughts on safeguarding human rights in a digital age. I am sure, as all of you know, yesterday the national security law is being passed in Hong Kong. It is but the end of our one country, two system. The law is not only a devastating blow to the liberty of our city, but also a huge hindrance on human rights in a digital realm on a global scale. The new law is so expensive in an unexpected way, even by the standards of China's legal system. It covers not only Hong Kong residents, but also anyone living abroad. That means foreign nationals working overseas and working abroad. The new law is asserting extraterritorial jurisdiction over every person on the planet. The law has really broad reach than any other mainland Chinese law of its law that's related to the internet. And to be honest, for foreign nationals, if you have ever said anything that might offend the Chinese or Hong Kong authorities, you will have to stay out of Hong Kong, because this law targets not only me as a Hong Konger, but those who ever criticize the Chinese government online, on Twitter, on Facebook, on any social media. You will be subject to legal prosecution if you ever set foot in Hong Kong. And of course, this law aims to generate fear and lead people into self-censorship online. And it encourages platforms like social media, like Facebook, Twitter, or any other online services like Google or Apple to practice self-censorship, screening users' generated content, banning certain discussions on so-called sensitive topics, and so on, so that they can circumvent legal obligation under this new national security law. This law will also be an excuse for the CCP to request content removal and limit the discourse online, as the law will hold them responsible for the content that are on their platforms. What is worse, that they have the right to demand any personal data for users from these platforms, and there's no way that these platforms can object under this new law, which is a devastating blow to the city's privacy and digital rights. It also marks the end of safe harbor policy and tech neutrality, because these service providers will be held responsible for any sensitive topics or illegal contents online. And China, on one hand, is limiting Hong Kongers' fundamental rights online, and at the same time, it aims at exporting its Great Firewall to the world, which hinders human rights on a global scale online. The Great Firewall of China has only one goal: to allow the government to decide what others is going to see or what others cannot see. And CCP is exporting its standards of political correctness along with its Great Firewall into the world through several means. One, it's like Chinese-made apps like TikTok or WeChat, and through fake news, as we experienced in the COVID pandemic, where it claims that China is not the origin of the virus, but the US is, or having a lot of fake news surrounding the COVID-19 pandemic. And the third one is trolling. And for Chinese-made app, TikTok is one of the largest and faster-growing global social media platform from Beijing. It heavily moderates its content and supposedly has localized censors for different jurisdictions, but it has famously limited speeches that is going against the Communist Party's rule. For example, you cannot talk about Tibet or Uyghurs. Those will be considered as sensitive topics and therefore be removed from the app. And for example, WeChat also has censors for even its foreign users. For example, in 2013, media reported that WeChat users outside of China experience censorship of chat messages that contain keywords like 法轮功 or Southern Weekend. These are the sensitive keywords in China as well. And actually, China's work in hindering the world's digital rights, it's not, they have helped multinational corporations, the tech giants like Apple, Facebook, Google, all have expressed its attempt to aid China in the systematic violation of human rights. For example, Apple has spanned a Hong Kong live map in Hong Kong, which shows protesters or citizens, where are the police and where are the conflicts. And this was originally banned from the Apple App Store. And on the Chinese version of the Apple App Store, VPNs, other communications apps were also banned. By adopting such double standards on its app store, Apple is actually dividing citizens in the world into two classes: one who have access to secure communications and VPNs and other tools that help secure their privacy and the fundamental rights, while others, like Chinese citizens, do not have access to these apps, and they are therefore deprived of the fundamental rights. These tech companies are going against their oath to defend human rights or their values that advocates human rights in order to satisfy China to enter the Chinese market. This is one of the biggest threat I see in the digital rights campaign that the world is having. On the other hand, these companies also complies to China's request of personal data. For example, Yahoo have gave access to journalist Xi Tao's email account, and he was imprisoned for almost a decade based on those data. And Facebook and Google also expressed their attempts to enter the Chinese market, which is very worrying because with so much personal data that they will hold and they are holding, it's actually a great threat to users' privacy under this kind of surveillance attempt that the Chinese have always been doing. Nobody's value should change depending where they are, and nobody should suffer from a deprivation of human rights no matter where they are. And I really ask the world to stand together with those who are under oppression in terms of digital rights so that we can help build a safer place for everyone online. Thank you very much.
No, thank you, Glacia. It really shines a light on many of the dilemmas with trying to protect digital rights and at the same time enforce national laws, because if we want to be able to enforce our laws online, then other governments will want to do the same. I would like to give the floor to Diego. Diego is working in EDRI, which is a European organization representing digital rights organizations from EU member states. Diego has a past of working in fundamental rights, both classical sense in the International Criminal Tribunal of the former Yugoslavia, and then the Fundamental Rights Agency of Europe. So has really a great background to brief us on these issues. So thank you very much, Diego.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you, Glacia. I think it was a great introduction. I want to focus on the three priorities that we see for us in EDRI for the next 2-3 years, perhaps even more, which could be interesting also for you in the liberal group. The first one is around artificial intelligence, but specifically I'd like to focus on something that was mentioned before by Astrid regarding facial recognition, which is for us one of the key priorities. And we have seen a very quick development of these technologies in Europe, and it has been very, very silent in the media and in most of the political landscape. It was interesting to see how when all of this was happening in Hong Kong, there were a lot of mentions in the media about the use by totalitarian regimes of facial recognition to look for protesters and to infringe fundamental rights, and duly so, because of course it was a serious case, especially in Hong Kong. But when we started analyzing if something like that was happening, we heard of some system similarly implemented in France, then we started looking and looking more in any other system around Europe, and we saw that around 15 European countries have a facial recognition or other systems of biometrics recognition in public spaces. As for us, I mean, there's a clear violation of not only of the right to privacy, but or data protection, which are the obvious ones, but the use of biometrics or other facial recognition or other similar technologies in publicly accessible spaces by law enforcement authorities impact also on other rights, such as the freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, and so on. So we believe that, especially in Europe but worldwide, we need to take action and ban all of these uses, which cannot be in any way in line with fundamental rights. Second is the issue of what I would call the digital Stockholm syndrome. So we live in this system where we are trapped in some of these big companies that we hate or that we don't like. Many of the features that they have, such as the one we are live streaming now, are also YouTube and many others that we have to use, and they're incredibly useful. But we hate them, but at the same time we need them and we need to use them because they are the only ways that we can express ourselves, that we can connect each other, we can have these sort of events. But this creates a sort of power imbalance. There's big companies who act as gatekeepers, who do not allow anyone else de facto in the market. Although theoretically they could start a new YouTube, but it's impossible that they compete with each other. And we need to find a way that we can ensure individual rights, but also with the protection of some of the victims that some of these systems create. I mean, of course, we are very much aware of the impact of hate speech on vulnerable communities, LGBTQI plus communities, women, people of color, and so on. So that needs to be tackled, but it cannot be tackled by giving these companies even more power over our freedom of speech. So I think it's a very tricky thing we need to do in Europe right now that could affect generally regulation around the world. And it's going to be probably the big battle that we're going to be facing now after the general data protection regulation. Everyone expects this to be the biggest battle. And finally, on data protection and privacy, well, we have built not only in Europe, but also globally through the Convention 108 plus, a strong system of laws, at least of regulation to defend data protection. But as we have seen in Europe, there's a serious problem with the enforcement. Some of DPAs are not acting strong enough. Some of them, the most important ones, as the one in Ireland, are not acting basically at all. And so either we give teeth to the regulation, or we're gonna face a serious problems. And I think we had a lot of tools at hand, and we can engage into collective action, we can go to court, and we can do more. But we also need to give money to these authorities to defend our rights. And I think that's my time already, and I will leave it to you for the questions.
Thank you very much, Diego. I think this was an excellent introduction to the discussions. Iglesia, you already touched upon the way that the platforms and the big tech companies are allowing themselves to be influenced by China. What do you see as a way of addressing this in order to protect the digital rights of users, not only in Europe, but all over the world? Are there demands that you see that we should be making? Are there restrictions or sanctions? I would like to hear your point of view on that.
I think on a legal level, for example, European Union has a really strict policy that member states should not be involved directly or indirectly in terms of human rights violation, and they have really strict restrictions on these kind of human rights violation related issues.
Seems like the connection to Glacier is freezing a little bit. Hopefully she will be there in a second. While we wait for Glacier, Diego, how do you see that we put pressure on the tech companies and the platforms from a European or from an American or African Union side to actually protect the digital rights of users?
Yes, well, so far we have been tackling some of the consequences of this action of these platforms. So we have the copyright directive, we have now the terrorist content regulation, and similar probably elsewhere around the world. But we have been realizing that in order to tackle the main problems that this platform causes to all of us, not only to some specific groups, we need to go to the root. We need to go to the business model behind it. This business model that is based on what they call engagement. So basically having you more time looking at your screen, so they can give you more advertising, show you more advertising, so you can buy more stuff. And either we attack this now. I think in Europe we have a great opportunity with the so-called Digital Services Act. So it's going to be a big reform of the platforms regulation in Europe, and we probably have some repercussions outside of Europe as well. So we need to deal with that. We need to go really with the business model, with the advertising online, with the implications that the system as such has for that. And one of the ways in which we see that people can leave these companies is not the silver bullet, and it's not the only measures, but one thing that we believe could help is interoperability. So the way that people could choose alternative companies, alternative services to Google, to Facebook, and to the big companies, and use with the similar features, of course, privacy friendly and data protection friendly, but use the similar features while being able to still sort of use the same benefits, but not being locked in this company. So we hope this can bring some change.
And how, Ashura, do you have a question? Because I would really like to have questions from all of the participants. Let me know if you do have one, and also please use the chat function in order to do that. Charlotte, do you have a question?
Yes, I was just wondering if there is an overview of what countries are doing similar things as the Chinese. I mean, asking the different platforms, asking Google, asking Facebook to censor themselves or censor users of their platforms. If there is such an overview.
Let's get back to that. Glacier, good to have you back.
Yeah, sorry, there's a bit of problem with the connection right here in Hong Kong now.
No worries.
Should I?
And perhaps not surprising, unfortunately.
So pay money to buy products from. It's actually involving in the oppression of my personal freedom, which is really scary. And I think the world has to know more about that. And there has to be a lot of advocacy and public education in this sense. And I think the European Union should step up its game in terms of making sure that this company are aware of what they're doing and refrain from doing so.
Thank you. We had a question while you were gone and coming back, which I think can be addressed to both of you. I mean, there is China, but there are other authoritarian regimes across the world. Do we have an overview of which countries are being specifically problematic in this aspect?
I think other than China, which is one of the biggest threats that I'm facing, I think Russia or other regimes in, for example, in Singapore is also problematic. For example, in Singapore, they have misinformation law, which sounds so-called fake news. But what is fake is defined by the government. And this has been used to oppress dissidents in Singapore. And in Russia, I don't think I have to elaborate a lot because in Russia, there is a lot of oppression of dissidents going on in the community, and it's very worrying and alarming that there are ways for these regimes to make use of so-called local laws to hinder service providers from providing regular services or providing services that enable citizens to defend themselves. And I think it's really worrying trend is there is an increased use of laws related to the internet or the digital realm to tighten its grip over citizens' freedom, not only from China, but also from other regimes as well.
Yes, I think, of course, I agree with Glacier in all of the examples she was mentioning. I think a general trend that we've seen in all around the world is the way to, apart from is blocking internet, to block all the way up, to try to prevent all of sort of communication. So our Member Access Now has this campaign, Keep It On, which is basically around the ensuring that no one is deprived from the internet, especially when they are protecting, which is probably when they need it the most. And regarding bad actors around, I think there are many. She was mentioning a few, but of course we cannot forget the massive mass surveillance system that the US created with the NSA and that Edward Snowden revealed in 2013. We have Turkey around the corner here in Europe, and in Europe, inside Europe, we also have some countries, especially or notably Hungary and Poland, that have used almost any opportunity to use the internet as a way to censor their citizens. We have seen similar cases in Spain with the case of the Catalan protests and so on. So basically, when I look at the general spectrum, what I see is that we need to legislate. We do legislate in order to think of the worst actors in the room, the worst students in the classroom, because we always think, okay, country X is going to be great, no problem is going to happen in Germany, or no big issues going to be with this legislation in Canada. But we need to think what, especially in Europe, what if we do bad legislation in Europe that is going to be then replicated by authoritarian regimes? How could they use or misuse the legislation that we are proposing? So I think then that's why we need to really think properly and thoroughly when we do any sort of legislation on how this could be misused by others and by the worst actors in the room.
I agree very much. That's why we need to be careful how we legislate. Beyond legislation, Marcus, you have an experience working on human rights and the running of responsible businesses. Do you have any insights on how we could perhaps, from other points of view than purely the legal aspects, make these businesses more responsible and hold them to account for not protecting the human rights of their users? It's a little bit unfair to ask Marcus if he hasn't seen the chat where he was mentioned. Let's see if he jumps in as soon as he gets the system to work. I think it's Diego mentioned that we shouldn't be giving the platforms too much power. I think this is also why it's really important that we have legislation on content and the use of data of the users that is quite narrow and quite well defined, because if we leave the scope for the platforms quite open in order for them to decide what is acceptable content and what should be taken down, then we are privatizing censorship to the platforms. Diego, there is also another question concerning the fair use of data. The attention economy, as it's been called, the amount of minutes that we're using a platform is also quite highly dependent on the data and intelligence that the platforms get on our use of the internet. Is there, how do you see fair use of data, and also how is this linked to the question of interoperability that you mentioned before?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think regarding the fair use of the data, I think the General Data Protection Regulation, which is, for those of you outside of Europe, is the main regulation regulating the protecting data protection, and has also been, in a way, copied by the International Convention. I think it's always often misperceived as in a way of restricting the use of data, which for us is actually the opposite. Is if you want to use personal data, go ahead. These are the rules. It's a safety guidelines for the use of data. So I believe that if the GDPR in our case or similar data protection laws around the world are strong, they can be well enforced, and there are also clear guidelines for small companies that want to do the best. They just don't have the capacity to have a data protection officer. They really want to do the best, but they don't know how to do it. I think that should be available so they can use the data in the best possible way. But then the issue of the attention economy is a bit broader, because it's about how the businesses collect all of the data and how they use it. So that's in a way solved in quote unquote in the legislation, but of course it needs to be enforced. But that's the tracking aspect, how we live in this sort of 24/7 commercial surveillance, where these companies are able to take all of this information from us, including where we are each moment, if you are protesting in Hong Kong or if you are buying something in the center of Brussels, and with whom you communicate and who your friends are. So I think this gives a lot of power to these companies, and that's why we need to be a serious conversation on what's the internet that we want, the society that we want, one which is ruled by these big companies, or one that is ruled by the people.
I think I greatly agree on what he has just said, but I have a little bit of things to add. I think it's really important that we start really looking into what actually personal data is, because it's so important that it affects every aspect of our lives now. And as we have heard, that it will know what I'm doing if I'm protesting or if I'm buying anything online. It has a full database of who I am, and there are a lot of people who are treating, especially companies, they are really willing, and they are treating personal data as commodities or something that they can sell, which is definitely not the case, because personal data is not something we can own. I don't actually own my personal data in a property way. My data will be always related to me, and it will always be about me, even though if I can sell it under any legal framework, and it will remain my data as long as I live, or even after I die. And there is a very great misunderstanding in the community that it's data is something that I can sell, and it doesn't matter. I can always pay with my data for free services, and this is not the case, because having so much data about us actually make us very vulnerable to so-called the economy of attention. Imagine this being misused. Actually, it has been misused. Look at the case of Cambridge Analytica and all the uses of micro-targeting that affects our psychology and our mental state. It's actually very dangerous if we don't actually look into what personal data actually is. And there is a lack of legal theory supporting the GDPR or any data protection regime that we are developing. And there is a urgent need that we look into what actually they are, so that we can develop better protection from consumers and users, and also for minorities and for everyone that is using the internet.
Thank you very much. And I also find it quite problematic with this way of discussing personal data as a commodity, because then we will commercialize something that is a fundamental right, the right to control our personal data. And this is not, we don't buy and sell our other fundamental rights, and therefore we shouldn't be buying and selling our personal data. Marcus is now reconnected, and we had a question for you, Marcus, concerning how do we hold companies such as the big tech companies and the online platforms liable for their protection or non-respect of human rights? There is legislation, of course, but what are the other tools that we could be using?
Karen, thanks a lot for the question. First of all, I see the biggest gap I see with respect to big tech companies. There's a lack of implementation of law. We see that administration in many countries simply do not understand what is going on. they lack the competence, they lack staff, they lack understanding, they lack technical possibilities to simply follow. So there's a big, let's say, gap in what states should actually do. And if you look at the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, they clearly say that business has a responsibility to respect human rights. But the main obligation is with the states and will always be with the states to protect citizens in their rights. So that's the biggest gap I see. So if we don't think of, let's say, highly developed countries like, let's say, the US, where there's a lack of will to control companies, or let's say the European Union, which is scattered, because with so many small countries, and even the bigger countries in the European Union lack the possibilities or the capacities to do this. So that's one thing we should do. But there's something else that can happen. And what we've seen in the last 2 days happening to Facebook, for example, I really like that. That is when big companies are taking their responsibility as corporate citizens and saying, okay, as long as Facebook is publishing or allowing hate speech on their platform, we're not going to give them any more money for any more of our advertising money. And I think that's also a way that companies can take their responsibility by making clear that if we work with an advertising platform like Facebook, we expect that Facebook will behave responsibly. So companies can do something, but they should also always ask for the state to really fulfill its duty. And that's just one example. Advertising money is just one example, but it's a good example because a lot of people are really following, a lot of companies are really following that.
I think it's a good point that the responsibility fundamentally is with the states and regional authorities, such as the European regional, not states and not really corporations such as the European Union, to keep the companies liable.
Maybe, Karen, I can add one thought on that, on the state's responsibility. If you break that down, you say, okay, maybe Germany or the European Union or Denmark, maybe the state, the federal state, they still have the capacity. Now, if you break it down to cities, local councils, how is a local city council, how should they be able to control what a company is installing as so-called smart city technology? You know, how they don't there's no way they can actually do that. They don't have the money, the knowledge, nothing. And that's a gap that needs to be closed.
And also a lot of the cities are dependent on big tech companies to be able to develop smart city technology, and don't really see the sort of pitfalls there is there. We have a question from Victor concerning the better thing for data protection. Is this to restrict the collection of data, or is it to restrict the usage of data? And how do we approach this? I mean, the approach from Europe has been to say there are you need to have prior consent for the collection of data, and then there are also restrictions on how you use it. But if both Glacier and Diego could briefly touch upon this, and then also if you have any final remarks before we close the public panel. Thank you.
I can go first. Well, as I was saying before, I'd like to see the data protection legislation in general all around the world as something more positive, rather not something restricting the use or even the collection of the data, but rather something that ensures that when personal data is going to be used, that is done properly, that is follows some safeguards that allows us to protect our fundamental rights. And as you were saying before, that it doesn't become a new commodity that we are going to be able to sell in a way. So I think there are some grounds that we need to follow, and the GDPR is one example, but it gives a few ideas on the main principles, which are data minimization, so having not collecting too much data if you don't use it, purpose limitation, using only the data for the end that you have collected it, not for something else. So there are a series of safeguards in order to ensure that. And also consent is, of course, one of the key legal bases, but there are others. For example, some authorities can collect personal data for statistical use, and that's for national archives and so on. So that is also allowed. But basically, yes, it's rather than restricting something, it allows to use personal data, but while protecting fundamental rights.
My take on that is, I think the current consent model places a lot of burden on users, because before, I don't anyone except for doing legal research, or that you actually look through your whole like consent form, you just scroll to the end and then click consent. I think this is the practice for 99% of the people. And at the same time, there is a huge imbalance of power between users and companies. If I want to keep my personal data safe from big tech companies and platform, then I have to a certain extent, give some of my data to Google, which I don't want to, and you don't actually have a choice because you are forced to use that. And because these big tech companies, they hold a lot of apps or services that is very popular. For example, if I want to connect with my friends and my family, I will have powered by Facebook. For sure, they collect all of my data when I'm using it. And this kind of huge imbalance of power actually makes us very difficult as users to go against or to actually state our needs or our needs as for privacy. And it is up to governments to be able to change using the legal system. And I think for both the use of data and the collection of data, there should be changes in the regime. For example, a term called the legitimate use of data, they can collect based on the legitimate use that they need for their operation. And they collect my data, and it is so-called used for the improvement of the service, but it may not be the service that I'm using. Our correct system, which nobody knows what the data, where my data is being used. Uncertainty is here. Companies have to disclose under, for example, legal requirements that they have to disclose algorithms, logic, or different practices when it comes to the use of personal data. This has to be implemented in the coming privacy data regime. And at the same time, we have to acknowledge that with the data and the information that these tech companies are holding, equivalent powers to government, we don't know almost. They can analyze their behavior, put them into categories of what they're going to do. And by having so much power, they don't actually have much obligation. And because of so-called private entities, that they are not subject to any kind of social contract or, but only simple business legal requirements. And it's very worrying that they hold, basically, those are public power. I can even put it in that way. So I think that we have to think about new, for example, contract drawing between users and these kind of platforms in order to protect the user's privacy. And I think it's always hard to strike a balance between profiting and protecting human rights in a digital age. And we have to do more studies, have to look into these topics into further detail to come up with better solutions that both sides, the user, companies, can survive. And I think we are on the right track because there have been a lot of studies and a lot of discussions and discourse on content moderation. For example, the current debate on Twitter about Trump's account, or we are having a lot of discussion on artificial intelligence regarding China, regarding the US, regarding the use in the world. And these are good starts, but we need to speed up because technology is developing at a speed that we can't quite follow. So we have to really speed up our discourse in order to catch up with the development of the technology.
Thank you so much. And unless Astrid wants to take the floor to thank you as well, I would like to close this public live stream of our panel. and we will be having more of a workshop session. It has been very inspiring to listen to both Diego and especially Glacia highlighting the human rights aspects of the use of technology, and both the business models and the technology itself. We need to have an approach that both addresses legislation, but all as citizens and politicians, but also addresses the tech companies from point of view of consumers, both directly and indirectly through the advertisers on the platforms. So thank you so much, and we will be